I'm going to be looking at Kings of War today. If some of you might remember these guys, who were a project I was working on last year, and you'll see some videos that have been put up about, they're basically a space dwarf army from a company called Mantic. In fact, you can see their symbol there, and I built a large army for a game called Warpath, and I bumped into a guy who was selling me some Space Marines. That sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? But he was selling me some Space Marines. He was getting out of Warhammer 40,000 and really into this system called Kings of War. Told me that basically a lot of players have left the Age of Sigmar. They're not particularly happy with it. They weren't happy with Warhammer Fantasy, and they wanted to give this new rule set a go. I said, well, I was a bit interested, but I do know how big the armies were. Would I have time to paint up 160 models? And he said, don't worry about it. And indeed, they were running a tournament at the end of November and try and get involved. So I showed him the models that I had. These are also produced by Mantic, and they look similar enough to the dwarf rifles. And I also had, from some of our wargaming past, some fancy dwarves as well from the Skull Path set. So I put them together to create an army and played a tournament last weekend, and it was really, really good. Basically I got to kind of like learn the new system, but I also got one of these, which is the wooden spoon for coming last. Not so great, but I did get a few bits of trinkets for it, including some new dice that maybe might roll better for me. The Kings of War actually has been really interesting to get into. This is a copy of the rule book, and there's some copies online that you can kind of get into. It's not, to me, that one of the big surprises is it's not very driven by a model set. Although Mantic do some fantastic figures, and you can see here, you're allowed pretty much to use whatever works, and that's really good because half the army options don't really exist. And at the tournament that we were at last weekend, it was really quite refreshing to see different armies. So I would come, elves and dwarves were probably the two most popular, but each elf and dwarf army looked completely different to the other elf and dwarf army, which was really good because some people were using Lord of the Rings miniatures, some people were using Warhammer Fantasy, and some people were using the Mantic figures. So it was really good to see that just pure mix of different things. This you might remember from before. That's a Mars Attacks giant robot that I basically created on a whim, and I've been able to use that. There's a big monstrous creature. It's called a steel behemoth, and it works really quite well for that. The key with the dwarves is they've got quite a lot of firepower. They've got access to a lot of rifles, which is what I used, and it was quite effective. Also a lot of siege engines over there. But also one of the benefits is that they're pretty highly armoured. They're not a particularly soft army at all. That they do have drawbacks. They don't have any magic users. This is what I'm using for the cavalry at the minute. But even, as you can imagine, with having short legs, even their cavalry isn't particularly brilliant. One of the key things with Kings of War that I found was movement is a little bit complicated, not overly complicated, but it affects your ability to fight and your ability to fire as well. And so if you get your stuff up your movement, you're quite vulnerable. Also, if you're attacked from your flanks or your rear, they basically can multiply the number of attacks they do. So, for instance, if this guy, if this guy gets attacked like that, rather than a forward attack, they're a lot more vulnerable and a lot more likely to get destroyed. War machines, war engines, over there, they really are easy to basically destroy. Which is interesting, which is really cool, because it does reflect the warfare history that we know about, where a flank attack could be completely devastating. But also, each base kind of relates to a kind of number of models or an effectiveness as models. And basically, you just put it on the table and you play that unit, and either the whole the unit can be slightly affected, it can be disorganized, or if it's routed, then the whole thing comes off the table, and you can wound it as well. And we will go through the rules in detail, but unlike Warhammer, you don't take an individual model off at a time. Either that entire unit is still functioning, or it's taken off completely. And everything really relies on a kind of morale roll, called a nerve, to determine whether a unit's happy and it's going to continue fighting, or it's going to come off. So because of that, you don't have to actually physically have the number of models on your base that it says in your army book. It's basically about making it look nice. So this is actually supposed to represent a unit of 20, and a lot of people, for example, were including bits of scenery on the base to make it look nicer, basically. And it was one of the reasons why some of the models really did look quite amazing. As I said, a lot of it's about forging narrative. I really like using these as my cavalry. There's a couple of boars there, with some dwarves riding them, and they're supported by a group of dogs. Some of those dogs come from the plague set from Dead Zone. There's also some, I think it's called Cosgrove wolves, that I saw and I really like the look of. So I went, yeah, let's put those on. And it means you can just try and fashion models that actually look like they're telling a story. So, for instance, I've got my infantry here, dwarf infantry here, and as you can see, there's a kamikaze dwarf slayer that's kind of jumping above them, ready to charge in with his axes, which is cool. These guys represent earth elementals. So, as dwarves, not surprisingly, you have, being related to miners, you have access to dwarf to elementals, and they're really quite a hard force. Humans, for instance, also can have a beast of war, which could be anything that looks the part, really, which is really good. I really enjoyed playing the game. Absolutely enjoyed learning the rules and the tactics. Dwarves are a slightly hard race to play. They've got a tremendous firepower, but as I've said before, that because flanking maneuvers can be so deadly, one of the problems is they just don't have enough movement to really charge, because dwarves typically, like this unit, will move 4 inches and they'll be able to charge 8. Now something like the elves move 6 inches and they can charge 12, so they can move around the table a lot more. Dwarves are very, very good in hand-to-hand combat, but it's actually getting them into the hand-to-hand combat that's really the tricky part. They have a lot of firepower, but most of their ranged attacks, first of all, they've got to be in the front 45-degree arc of your troops, and also you need to not have moved to kind of represent the idea of people reloading and then fire. If you've moved, you're not able to fire, and so maneuvering a unit so that they're in a good firing position, and as soon as they're in a good firing position, you can't actually fire. You have to wait till next turn. Makes them slightly tricky to use. They're not, but then you wouldn't want an all-powerful army. You wouldn't want anyone to have an all-powerful army. So, kind of using that ability to fire as effectively as possible is really key. And with a 24-inch range, and as I said, units like, for instance, just the elf infantry being able to cover 12 inches a turn, and something like their cavalry probably being able to cover close to 24 inches in a turn to charge. Yeah, you've got to be a bit cautious, and certainly your range firepower doesn't mean that you're going to get away easily. you can't decimate it. But then that's why it's a fantasy historical battle and not modern battle where basically the machine gun is king. Anyway, so that was a quick look through my Kings of War army. They're doing another. There's going to be another tournament early next year that we're really looking forward to going to. But have really enjoyed the variety of models that we're allowed to field, and really just the way the game plays. Cameron's going to be working on an army, a Kingdom of Men army, and it'll be. We hope to be getting some games in early next year for battle reports. Catch you later.